A life of luxury, a mistake in the eyes of the world, and a cruel decision that changes everything. Kicked out of her home at 13 for being pregnant, a young girl faces the harsh reality of the streets until she finds shelter in the heart of a generous woman. Together they defy prejudices, build a new home, and prove that the power of love can overcome even the deepest scars. But when the past comes knocking, bringing secrets and pleas for forgiveness, will forgiveness be enough to heal the wounds? A story of resilience, rebuilt bonds, and the transformative power of starting over. The morning sun of Chicago filtered through the silk curtains of Emily's bedroom, illuminating a collection of teddy bears meticulously arranged on the king-size bed. The alarm clock read 6:30, but she had been awake for hours, sitting on the bathroom floor of her suite, staring with tear-filled eyes at the positive pregnancy test in her trembling hands. "This can't be happening," she whispered to herself, as silent tears streamed down her still childlike face. Emily was only 13, and her life until then sheltered within the walls of the Thompson and Smith mansion in Beverly Hills was about to crumble. Outside the room, the familiar sounds of the morning routine began to intensify. The clinking of cutlery in the kitchen, where Dawn, the housekeeper, was preparing the elaborate breakfast that Emily's father, Richard, demanded every morning. The hurried footsteps of her mother, Helen, likely already impeccably dressed for another day of social engagements. Emily took a deep breath, tucked the test into her school uniform pocket, and tried to compose herself in front of the mirror. Her green eyes, inherited from her father, were slightly swollen, but nothing a good makeup job couldn't hide. She had learned early on from her mother the importance of keeping up appearances. "Emily, darling, are you ready yet?" Helen's voice came from the other side of the door, making the girl jump. "I'm coming, Mum," she replied, trying to control the tremor in her voice. At the breakfast table, Richard flipped through the financial newspaper, while Helen organized her social calendar on her tablet. Emily poked listlessly at the scrambled eggs on her plate, feeling her stomach churn with every bite. "Emily, stop playing with your food," scolded Helen without taking her eyes off the screen. "It's not appropriate for a young lady of your social standing to display poor table manners." Richard lowered the newspaper for a moment, adjusting his Italian-framed glasses to observe his daughter. "You look paler than usual, dear. Are you feeling all right?" "I'm just a bit unwell," murmured Emily, avoiding her father's piercing gaze. "It must be nerves about the charity ball this weekend," commented Helen, finally looking up. "After all, it will be your official debut into society. The Versace dress we chose is simply stunning." Emily felt a wave of nausea rise in her throat. The ball. How could she attend the ball? How could she keep pretending that everything was normal? Her hands began to tremble under the table, and a cold drop of sweat trickled down her forehead. "Excuse me," she said abruptly, rising from the table. But before she could take 2 steps, the pregnancy test slipped out of her uniform pocket, landing with a dull thud on the Persian rug in the dining room. The silence that followed was deafening. Helen let her tablet drop onto the table, and Richard remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the small object that had just shattered the perfect facade he had worked so hard to build. "What is this?" Helen's voice came out as a choked whisper, though she knew the answer perfectly well. Emily felt her legs weaken. She had rehearsed 1,000 ways to tell her parents, but none compared to the cruelty of that moment. The tears she had held back all morning finally overflowed. I'm pregnant," she confessed, her voice almost inaudible in the tomb-like silence of the room. Richard slowly rose to his feet, his imposing figure casting a shadow over his daughter. His face, usually controlled and serene, twisted into a mask of fury and disappointment. "Do you have any idea," he began, his voice trembling with contained anger, "what this means for our family, for our reputation?" Helen brought her hands to her face, letting out a sharp sob. "What will people say? How will I face the Ladies' Charity Committee? Years of social work, all our prestige." "Who is the father?" Richard demanded, his voice sharp as steel. Emily hugged herself, feeling smaller than ever. "Luke." "From the 3rd year?" "A boy from school?" Helen practically shouted. "My God, this can't be happening." "Not with our family." Richard began pacing back and forth, running his hands through his impeccably groomed grey hair. His calculating mind was already assessing the damage, the consequences, the headlines that would surely emerge when the news leaked. Richard's office was a sanctuary of mahogany and leather, where decisions worth millions were made daily. That night, however, the decision at hand was far more personal and painful. Helen was seated in the Italian leather armchair, her hands trembling as she held a glass of red wine, while Richard nervously paced the room. "We can't let this destroy everything we've built," he declared, his voice laden with calculated coldness. "The shareholders, the business partners, the press. Do you have any idea of the scandal this would cause?" Helen took a long sip of wine, trying to calm her nerves. "Richard, she's our only daughter, and that's exactly why she should have been more careful with our reputation," he interrupted, slamming his hand on the mahogany desk. "We raised her with all the luxury, all the education, and this is how she repays us." Upstairs, Emily was curled up in her bed, clutching her favorite teddy bear, listening to fragments of the argument echoing through the floor. Each word felt like a dagger to her already shattered heart. Dawn, the housekeeper who had practically raised her, entered the room quietly, carrying a cup of chamomile tea. Her kind eyes were misty as she saw the suffering of the girl she considered almost a daughter. "Here, dear," whispered Dawn, sitting on the edge of the bed. "It will help calm your nerves." Emily accepted the cup with trembling hands. "Dawn, what's going to happen to me?" The housekeeper opened her mouth to respond, but was interrupted by the sound of firm footsteps coming up the stairs. Richard and Helen entered the room, their faces marked by a decision that seemed to have cost them years of their lives. "Emily," Richard began, his voice controlled but icy, "your mother and I have talked at length, and we've come to a conclusion." Helen remained a few steps behind her husband, her face a porcelain mask on the verge of cracking. Dawn, sensing the tension in the air, discreetly left the room, casting one last worried glance at Emily. "You can no longer live here," Richard declared, each word falling like a sentence. "Your presence in this house, in this situation, is a threat to everything we've built." Emily felt as if the air had been sucked from her lungs. "Dad, please. You have until tomorrow to pack your things," he continued, ignoring the tears beginning to stream down his daughter's face. "We'll arrange a bank account with enough money for you to settle somewhere else." "Richard." Helen tried to intervene, her voice trembling. "It's for the best, Helen," he cut in, turning to leave the room. "For the family, for the business, for our social standing." Emily looked pleadingly at her mother, searching for one last thread of hope. Helen averted her gaze, her own tears finally escaping. "I'm sorry, my dear," she murmured, following her husband out of the room. Alone, Emily felt her world completely crumble. The room that had always been her refuge now felt suffocating, every luxury item a cruel reminder of what she was about to lose. Through the window, she could see the lights of Chicago shining, indifferent to her personal drama. Dawn returned to the room some time later, finding Emily still frozen in the same position. Without a word, the housekeeper began to gather some clothes and essential items, packing them into a discreet suitcase. "I can't do much, child," said Dawn, her voice choked. "But take this." She handed over an envelope containing some savings she had kept for years. "It's not much, but it might help in the first few days." Emily hugged the housekeeper, sobbing against her impeccably starched apron. "What am I going to do, Dawn? Where will I go?" "Trust in God, my dear," Dawn replied, stroking the young woman's hair. "He never gives us a burden heavier than we can bear." That night, Emily did not sleep. She stayed up, observing every detail of her room, every memory of a life she was about to leave behind. The next morning, with just a suitcase of clothes and Dawn's envelope, she would leave behind not only a house but an entire life of protection and privileges. The first night on the streets of Chicago was a brutal shock for Emily. The biting cold of the Chicago winter seeped through the thin coat she wore, constantly reminding her of the comfort she had left behind. Sitting on a bench in Millennium Park, she watched the endless flow of people rushing by, some casting suspicious or pitying glances at the lonely teenager. The money Dawn had given her seemed to burn in her pocket. She knew she needed to save every penny, but her stomach growled mercilessly. How long had it been since she last ate? The disastrous breakfast at the mansion felt like it had happened in another lifetime. First time on the streets, huh, sweetie? A woman in her 60s carrying shopping bags stopped in front of her. Her face, marked by time, showed a wisdom gained from life's harsh corners. Emily simply nodded, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to fall again. The woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Sophie, sat down beside her on the bench. "This isn't a place for a girl like you to be alone," the woman continued, her kind eyes assessing the situation. "Especially—" Her gaze discreetly landed on Emily's still imperceptible belly. "How did you—" Emily began, surprised. Mrs. Sophie gave a knowing smile. "Years of life, my dear. We learn to recognize certain signs. Come with me, I know a place where you can spend the night." Emily hesitated, years of warnings about not trusting strangers echoing in her mind. But something in that woman's gaze inspired trust, and frankly, what were her alternatives? The hostel where Mrs. Sophie took her was simple but clean. The peeling walls told stories of countless lives that had passed through there, seeking a fresh start or just a moment of rest on their journeys. "Only one night available," explained the hostel worker, a middle-aged woman named Claire. "Tomorrow, you'll need to find another place." Lying on the narrow bunk that night, Emily felt the weight of her new reality. The sounds were different there, distant snores, whispers, muffled cries. So different from the tomb-like silence of her room in the mansion. The next morning, after a simple coffee, Emily returned to the streets. She began to notice details of the city she had never noticed before, even though she had lived there her entire life. The street vendors setting up their stalls, the smell of fresh bread coming from the bakeries, the buzz of workers heading to the subway. It was during this walk that she found the Morning Star Bakery. The modest establishment with its foggy windows and worn-out sign exuded an irresistible aroma of fresh bread and brewed coffee. "Would you like to try a warm roll, young lady?" The voice came from a woman in her 50s, sweeping the sidewalk in front of the bakery. Mrs. Amelia, as Emily would later find out her name was, had warm brown eyes and a smile that seemed to embrace people. Emily touched the little money she still had in her pocket, hesitant. As if reading her thoughts, Mrs. Amelia added, "It's on the house. You look like you could use a strong coffee." The inside of the bakery was cozy, with old but well-maintained formica tables and a glass counter displaying an assortment of breads and pastries. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, bringing a sense of comfort that Emily hadn't felt since she left home. As she ate the buttered bread and sipped the coffee with milk, Emily couldn't hold back the tears that silently streamed down her face. They weren't just tears of sadness, but also of gratitude for that small act of kindness. Mrs. Amelia discreetly observed the young woman, her heart aching at the sight of so much pain in someone so young. There was something familiar about the girl, something that reminded her of her own daughter, whom she had lost years ago in a car accident. The same lost look, the same vulnerability mixed with an inner strength that was still unknown. "Do you have somewhere to go?" Mrs. Amelia asked, sitting down at the table with Emily. The young woman shook her head, swallowing hard. "The shelter. Where I stayed last night only allows one night." Mrs. Amelia fell silent for a few moments, as if wrestling with an internal battle. Finally, she said, "I have a spare room above the bakery. It's nothing fancy, but—" Emily looked up, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. You're offering me a place to stay?" "For now," Mrs. Amelia replied cautiously. "Until you find your path. But on one condition, you'll need to help out at the bakery. The work is hard. We start before the sun rises." For the first time in days, a genuine smile lit up Emily's face. "I accept. I've never worked before, but I promise I'll learn. I'll do my best." The first days at the bakery were a true test of endurance for Emily. Her delicate hands, accustomed only to holding silverware and turning pages of expensive books, now faced the reality of manual labor. Blisters formed on her fingers as she learned to handle the dough, and her back ached from the effort of carrying sacks of flour. Mrs. Amelia watched with a mix of concern and admiration at the young woman's determination. "Take it easy, girl," she advised whenever she saw Emily pushing herself too hard. "Pregnancy isn't an illness, but it's also not a time to overdo it." The news of Emily's pregnancy didn't shock Mrs. Amelia as much as the young woman had expected. "Life is full of surprises, some planned, others not so much," was her only comment when Emily, through tears, revealed her condition. The mornings at the bakery had their own rhythm, almost musical. The sound of dough being kneaded, the clinking of metal pans, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee, all blended into a symphony that gradually became familiar to Emily. "The secret to bread isn't just in the recipe," Mrs. Amelia explained, as she taught Emily how to knead the dough. "It's in the love you put into every movement, into every fold of the dough the bread can feel when it's made with care." Emily absorbed each lesson with a thirst for learning that even surprised herself. Gradually, her hands developed the necessary muscle memory, and she began to understand the exact moment when the dough was just right, when the bread needed to go into the oven, and the ideal temperature for each type of bake. The regular customers of the bakery, initially wary of the presence of the unfamiliar young woman, slowly began to warm up to her dedication and her shy smile. Mildred, a lady who came every day to buy fresh French bread, was the first to notice Emily's pregnancy. "You need to eat well, girl," she would say, always setting aside an extra piece of cake for Emily. "A child needs a strong mother." However, not everyone was as understanding. Emily could hear the whispers and malicious comments from some customers when they thought she wasn't around. "A girl her age pregnant, and what a shame," some said. "Amelia shouldn't be giving shelter to that kind of person," others murmured. Amelia, however, faced the criticism with the same firmness with which she faced life. "People who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones," she would reply curtly when someone dared to make a negative comment in her presence. The nights were the hardest times for Emily. Alone in the small room above the bakery, her thoughts inevitably turned to her old life. She found herself wondering if her parents missed her, if they ever regretted the decision they had made. One particularly difficult night, when the nausea of pregnancy seemed worse than usual, Amelia went up to the room with a cup of chamomile and ginger tea. She found Emily curled up in bed, clutching an old photo of her family that she had managed to bring with her. "You know, Emily," Amelia began, sitting on the edge of the bed, "I lost my daughter, Anna Louise, 5 years ago. She was your age when she passed." Her eyes filled with restrained tears. "Since then, the bakery has been my only company, until you came along." Emily held the woman's hand, feeling the rough texture of years of labor. "Why did you help me, Mrs. Amelia?" "Because sometimes God takes something precious from us, but gives us the chance to do things differently with someone else," she replied, wiping away a tear. "You remind me so much of Anna Louise, the same strength hidden behind frightened eyes." That night, something shifted in the relationship between the two. They were no longer just employer and employee, or even benefactor and protégé. Deeper bond was beginning to form, nurtured by the mutual understanding of two souls who knew the pain of loss. Emily began to dedicate herself even more to the bakery, not just out of gratitude, but out of a genuine desire to see the place thrive. Her timid suggestions for new products were well received by Mrs. Amelia, who watched with satisfaction as the young woman's enthusiasm grew. "We could make decorated cupcakes," Emily suggested one day, remembering the pastry classes she had taken as a hobby in her old life. "And maybe specialty coffee, the kind with designs in the milk?" Mrs. Amelia smiled, seeing in Emily's eyes the spark of enthusiasm she hadn't seen in herself for so long. "Then let's learn together," she replied, already planning the necessary changes. The sound of the first thunderclaps woke Emily even earlier than usual. Her belly, now visibly showing at 5 months pregnant, made it harder to find a comfortable sleeping position. Through the window of her small room, she could see the dark clouds gathering in the Chicago sky, heralding a strong storm. She carefully descended the stairs, finding Mrs. Amelia already fully active in the bakery. The smell of yeast and fresh coffee filled the air, but something felt different that morning. The worried expression on the woman's face betrayed that something was wrong. "Mrs. Amelia, did something happen?" The woman sighed, handing Emily a letter that had just arrived. It was a notice from the City Hall, alerting them about irregularities in the bakery's operating permit. Additionally, there was a series of requirements to comply with the latest health regulations. "I don't know where I'll get the money for all these renovations," confessed Mrs. Amelia, running her hand over her tired face. "The bakery has barely been staying afloat these past few months." Emily felt a tightness in her chest. She knew her presence had driven away some more conservative customers, who didn't look kindly on a pregnant teenager working at the establishment. But now, seeing the concern on her benefactor's face, she realized the situation was even more serious. "How much time do we have to make the adjustments?" asked Emily, already mentally calculating possible solutions. 30 days, replied Mrs. Amelia, disheartened. And the inspector made it very clear there would be no extensions. Emily spent the entire day thinking, while serving customers and preparing the bread. Her hands worked automatically, but her mind buzzed with ideas. That night, after the bakery closed, she presented her plan to Mrs. Amelia. "What if we transform the bakery into something more modern, more appealing to a different audience?" suggested Emily, her eyes shining with enthusiasm. "We can keep the essence of the place but add elements that attract people willing to pay a little more for special products." Mrs. Amelia listened attentively as Emily unfolded her plan. The young woman talked about creating a space for gourmet coffee, introducing a line of artisanal bread and elaborate pastries, and transforming the environment with a cozy yet contemporary decor. "But this will cost much more than just the adjustments required by the city," pondered Mrs. Amelia. Emily took a deep breath before making her next proposal. I have a bank account that my father opened before sending me away. I never wanted to use that money, but now—" Mrs. Amelia widened her eyes, understanding the magnitude of what Emily was offering. "I can't accept it, dear. That money is yours. It's for your future, for your baby." "You gave me a roof when I had nowhere to go," replied Emily, with tears in her eyes. "You taught me the value of work, treated me like family. Let me give back, please." After much discussion, they reached an agreement. They would use part of Emily's money as an investment, making her a minority partner in the business. The renovations began immediately, and for 2 weeks, the bakery operated partially, only with essential sales. Emily surprised everyone with her knowledge of culinary trends and business management, remnants of her previous life that now found a real purpose. Every decision was discussed together with Mrs. Amelia, who gradually became excited about the changes. The transformation went beyond the physical space. Emily dedicated herself to training the staff in customer service techniques, while Mrs. Amelia perfected her traditional recipes to create special versions. The old Formica counter was replaced with a modern display, and the walls were painted a soft aqua green that made the environment more welcoming. On the reopening day, a line formed outside the bakery. The aroma of artisanal bread and specialty coffee attracted curious onlookers and long-time customers, many of whom were pleasantly surprised by the changes. Mrs. Mildred, a loyal customer, was the first to try the new menu. "This is what I call a change for the better," she declared loudly, making sure everyone around could hear, "and it's still our beloved Morning Star Bakery." For Emily, seeing the smile on Mrs. Amelia's face as she served the customers was worth more than all the money invested. The bakery wasn't just a business, it was a symbol of new beginnings, transformation, and hope. That night, after closing on the first day of the bakery's new chapter, Mrs. Amelia hugged Emily tightly. "You're not just a force of nature, girl," she said, emotional. "You're an angel that God placed in my path." Emily gently touched her belly, feeling the baby's first movements, as if they too were celebrating this moment of victory. There, amidst the scent of fresh bread and coffee, she finally began to understand that family wasn't just about blood, it was about love and choices. The success of the new Morning Star Bakery exceeded all expectations. In just a few months, the establishment became a beloved neighborhood hotspot, attracting not only locals, but also people from other parts of the city, curious to see the place that was making such a splash on social media. Emily, now with a noticeably 7-month pregnant belly, managed the service with a mix of grace and efficiency that impressed everyone. Her constant presence and warm smile had become a fundamental part of the bakery's identity. One particularly busy morning, As she was arranging the dessert display, Emily noticed a familiar figure across the street. Dawn, her former governess, was standing on the sidewalk, watching the bakery with tears in her eyes. When their gazes met, the woman couldn't contain her emotions and hurriedly crossed the street. "My dear girl," exclaimed Dawn, embracing Emily carefully because of her belly. "For months I've been trying to find out where you are. Your parents. They don't know I'm here, but I needed so much to see you, to know if you're okay." Emily led Dawn to a more secluded table where they could talk privately. Mrs. Amelia, noticing the situation, personally arranged a tray with coffee and the house's special bread. "How did you find me, Dawn?" "A client from the mansion mentioned a bakery that had been renovated by a pregnant young woman," explained Dawn, her eyes scanning every detail of Emily's face as if trying to make up for all the months of absence. "When I heard the story, my heart told me it could only be you." Dawn shared that the Thompson and Smith mansion hadn't been the same since Emily left. Richard had buried himself even deeper in work, spending entire days at the office. Helen, on the other hand, had withdrawn from social events, citing health issues. "Your mother cries every day in your room," Dawn revealed, holding Emily's hands. "But pride, that cursed pride keeps them from reaching out to you." Emily felt a lump in her throat. The pain of rejection was still there, but now it was different. It was no longer that sharp, desperate pain from the first few days. It had transformed into something deeper, more mature. "They lost the right to be part of my life when they abandoned me," said Emily, surprising herself with the firmness in her own voice. "But you, Dawn, you will always be welcome here." At that moment, the baby gave a particularly strong kick, making Emily smile. Dawn, with tears in her eyes, asked for permission to touch the young woman's belly. "It's a girl," Emily revealed, guiding Dawn's hand to the spot where her daughter usually moved the most. "I'm going to name her Lauren." "Lauren," Dawn repeated, savoring the name. "It's a beautiful name, strong like you." Mrs. Amelia, who had been discreetly observing the scene, approached with another bottle of coffee. "Our Emily has become an extraordinary woman," she said to Dawn, "and she'll be a wonderful mother." The two women exchanged looks of mutual understanding, one who had cared for Emily during her privileged childhood, the other who had taken her in during her most vulnerable moment. Both sharing love for that young woman who, against all odds, was flourishing. "Don't tell my parents where I am," Emily asked, as Dawn prepared to leave. "Not yet. I need to do this my way, in my own time." Dawn promised to keep it a secret, but before leaving she handed Emily a small package. Inside was a light blue crocheted shoe, the first one Emily had worn as a baby. "I've kept it all these years," explained Dawn. "Now it belongs to your daughter." That visit stirred feelings in Emily that she had tried to suppress. That night, alone in her room, she held the crocheted shoe to her chest and allowed herself to cry, not out of sadness or anger, but out of gratitude for her journey. "Your life will be different, my little one," she whispered to her belly. "You will be loved and accepted exactly as you are." At the bakery, the days remained intense. Emily had implemented an online ordering system that was proving to be a great success, especially for events. Her previous experience with social media had proven invaluable, and soon the Morning Star Bakery had a significant digital presence. "I never imagined our bakery would come this far," commented Mrs. Amelia one night as they closed the cash register. "You've not only transformed the business, but brought new life to everything." Emily smiled, thinking about how her own life had transformed. From a spoiled girl to an independent woman, from a rejected daughter to a soon-to-be mother, from a temporary guest to a partner in a thriving business. Every challenge, every obstacle had contributed to her growth. Lauren's arrival into the world happened on a rainy September dawn. Emily was putting the finishing touches on a wedding cake when she felt the first contractions. Mrs. Amelia, who had been on alert for days, immediately called a taxi and accompanied the young woman to the nearest public hospital. "Breathe, my dear," Mrs. Amelia instructed, holding Emily's hand firmly during the contractions. "You're strong, you can do this." The hours that followed were intense. Emily, between contractions, couldn't help but notice the irony of the situation. She, who had been born in one of the most expensive hospitals in Chicago, was now giving birth to her daughter in a public maternity ward. But the warmth and professionalism of the medical team made her feel welcomed and safe. "Come on, Emily, one more push," encouraged the doctor, Dr. Rachel, who was overseeing the delivery. "Your daughter is almost here." At 5:47 in the morning, Lauren's strong cry echoed through the delivery room. The little one came into the world weighing 3.2 kilograms, with dark hair and the same green eyes as her mother. When the nurse placed the baby in her arms, Emily felt an emotion she had never experienced before, an unconditional, pure, and overwhelming love. "Welcome, my little warrior," Emily whispered, gently kissing her daughter's forehead. Mrs. Amelia, who watched the scene with tears in her eyes, felt her heart overflow with joy. The first days with Lauren were an emotional roller coaster. Emily discovered that theories about motherhood were very different from practice. The sleepless nights, the doubts about breastfeeding, the crying that sometimes seemed impossible to soothe, everything was new and challenging. But she wasn't alone. Mrs. Amelia proved to be a true stand-in grandmother, always present with practical advice and emotional support. The staff at the bakery took turns helping, allowing Emily to rest when needed. "You need to eat well to have good milk," Mrs. Amelia insisted, preparing nutritious soups and whole-grain breads especially for Emily. A breastfeeding mother needs double the energy. Dawn also became a constant presence, visiting whenever possible with small gifts for Lauren. During one of these visits, she brought news that shook Emily. "Your mother found out you had the baby," Dawn revealed cautiously. "An acquaintance saw you at the hospital and told her." Emily felt her heart tighten. "How did she react?" "She cried a lot," Dawn replied. "She spent hours looking at your old baby photos. Your father, well, he's still burying himself in work, but I noticed he's been keeping newspaper clippings." About the bakery. The news stirred conflicting emotions in Emily. Part of her wanted her parents to meet Lauren to see their granddaughter grow up. Another part still carried the scars of abandonment, the fear of exposing her daughter to the same kind of rejection she had endured. Lauren grew strong and healthy, charming everyone with her easy smile and sweet personality. By 3 months, she was already the bakery's official mascot, receiving affection and attention from the regular customers. "She has your eyes," Mildred commented one day, admiring Lauren in her baby carrier behind the counter. "But there's something about her smile that reminds me of Amelia." Emily smiled, watching her daughter play with a rattle. It was true, Lauren had inherited not just genetic traits, but also the loving environment in which she was growing up. The bakery was her home, the staff and customers, her extended family. Over time, Emily developed a routine that allowed her to balance motherhood with work. She improvised a small space in the back of the bakery that served as a nursing and resting area. Lauren adapted perfectly to the rhythm of the place, her deepest sleep lulled by the familiar scent of fresh bread. "You know, Emily," said Mrs. Amelia one night as they watched Lauren sleep, "when I lost my Anna Louise, I thought I would never be able to feel true joy again. But you and Lauren, you brought light back into my life." Emily hugged the woman who had become her second mother. "You saved us, Mrs. Amelia. You gave us a home when we needed it most." The two women stayed there in silence, watching Lauren's peaceful sleep. Outside, the city continued its frantic pace. But inside that small apartment above the bakery, time seemed to flow differently, sweeter, gentler. Emily picked up the crocheted slipper that Dawn had given her and placed it next to Lauren in the crib. It was a bridge between her past and her present, a reminder that even the hardest stories can have new chapters full of hope. The years passed like pages of a book being turned by the wind. Lauren grew up surrounded by the love of the family that fate had provided her, becoming a smart and affectionate girl. By the age of 12, she was known throughout the neighborhood as the little pastry chef of the Morning Star Bakery, always experimenting with new recipes in the bakery's kitchen under the watchful eyes of her mother and Mrs. Amelia. The Morning Star Bakery had become one of the most beloved establishments in the area. Emily, now 26, had managed to expand the business, turning it into a reference for artisanal pastry. The original small space gave way to a charming two-story cafe bakery where Mrs. Amelia's traditional recipes coexisted harmoniously with Emily's contemporary creations. "Mom, look what I came up with." "Wow!" exclaimed Lauren on a Saturday afternoon, proudly presenting a cupcake decorated with fondant flowers that she had made herself. Her dark hair was tied up in a messy bun, and flower stains dotted her freckled face. Emily watched her daughter's creation with a smile on her lips. It was impossible not to see herself reflected in that girl. The same passion for baking, the same sparkle in her green eyes when she created something new. But Lauren had something Emily hadn't had in her own childhood, the freedom to be herself. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," praised Emily, hugging her daughter. "Grandma Amelia is going to love seeing this." Mrs. Amelia, who at 63 still had the same energy as ever, had become the grandmother Lauren had never had. Her relationship with Emily had also deepened over the years, evolving into a bond that went far beyond their professional partnership. "That girl has a gift," Mrs. Amelia often remarked, watching Lauren work in the kitchen, "just like her mother." Life had found its rhythm. Mornings started early with the preparation of bread and pastries. Lauren went to school in the afternoon, always returning in time to help with the last batches of the day. Evenings were reserved for homework, shared stories, and plans for the future. However, not everything was perfect. Emily still carried the weight of her parents' choices in her heart. Dawn remained her only link to the past, bringing sporadic news of the Thompson and Smith family. Through her, Emily had learned that her father was facing health issues and that her mother had become more reserved, less concerned with appearances. "Your mother keeps all the articles about the bakery," Dawn shared during one of her visits. "She is proud of you, Emily, even if she doesn't know how to show it." Lauren, curious as all children are, often asked about her other grandparents. Emily always tried to be honest yet gentle in her answers, explaining that some families were different, and that sometimes people needed a lot of time to learn how to deal with their mistakes. One day, while organizing the bakery's photo album, Lauren found an old picture of Emily with her parents, taken at some social event years ago. "They look so serious," Lauren observed, studying the image. "They're not like Grandma Amelia." Emily hugged her daughter, feeling a mix of emotions. "Not everyone knows how to show love in the same way, sweetheart, but that doesn't diminish the love we have for each other." The success of the Morning Star Bakery had become news in several local publications. A culinary magazine even did a special feature on the establishment, highlighting the story of resilience behind the business. The article brought a new wave of customers, curious to visit the place that had turned a story of rejection into one of success and warmth. "You've built something extraordinary here," said a journalist during an interview. "What's the secret?" Emily looked around, at Mrs. Amelia, who was teaching Lauren how to make her famous cinnamon roll, at the staff who felt more like family, at the regular customers who knew everyone by name. "The secret is understanding that family isn't just about blood," she replied. "It's about choosing to stay, choosing to love, choosing to start over every day." At night, after the last customer had left and Lauren was already asleep, Emily would go up to the bakery's rooftop, her favorite place to think. From there, she could see the city lights, so different from the ones she used to watch from the window of her old room in the Thompson and Smith mansion. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon, and the Morning Star Bakery was closed for a special event, the celebration of Mrs. Amelia's 70th birthday. Emily and Lauren had spent the entire week planning every detail of the surprise party, from the decorations to the special menu. "Do you think Grandma Amelia will like it?" asked Lauren, adjusting the flower arrangement on the main table for the 10th time. Her green eyes, so much like her mother's, sparkled with anticipation. Emily smiled, admiring the work they had done. The bakery was unrecognizable, transformed into a cozy celebration space. Flower garlands hung from the ceiling, elegantly decorated. Tables filled the room, and a photo display told the story of the bakery and its owner over the years. "She's going to love it, sweetheart," Emily replied, hugging her daughter. "Especially because you made all the desserts." The sound of the door opening made both of them turn, expecting to see Dawn, who had gone out to distract Mrs. Amelia. However, it was an elegant woman with greying hair who entered, Helen Thompson and Smith, Emily's mother. Time seemed to freeze. Emily felt her heart race, while Lauren, sensing her mother's sudden tension, squeezed her hand tightly. "Emily." Helen's voice trembled. Her eyes, marked by deeper expression lines than Emily remembered, shifted between her daughter and granddaughter. I saw about the party in the neighborhood newspaper." The silence that followed was heavy, laden with 13 years of unspoken words. Helen took a hesitant step forward, her hands nervously twisting. "Your father," she began, but her voice faltered. She took a deep breath before continuing. "Your father is in the hospital. His heart. The doctors don't know how much time." Emily felt her legs weaken. Lauren, showing a maturity beyond her 12 years, pulled a chair for her mother to sit. "You must be my grandmother," said Lauren, breaking the tense silence. Her voice was firm, but gentle. "I'm Lauren." Helen covered her mouth with her hands, tears streaming down her now makeup-free face. "You look so much like your mother," she whispered. At that moment, the door opened again, and Mrs. Amelia entered, followed by Dawn. The woman stopped abruptly. Upon noticing the scene before her, her festive expression turning into a mask of concern. "Emily, dear," Mrs. Amelia began, instinctively moving to protect the one she considered her daughter. "It's okay, Mrs. Amelia," said Emily, standing up. Her eyes never left her mother's. "Did you come for the party?" Helen seemed confused for a moment, then noticed the decorations around her. "No, I just needed to see you. I needed to tell you so many things." "Grandma Amelia," called Lauren, once again showing her unique sensitivity, "don't you want to show my other grandmother the old photos from the bakery? There are some of Mom when she first arrived here." Mrs. Amelia hesitated for a moment, but a look from Emily reassured her. The two women walked away toward the photo wall, leaving mother and daughter with a moment of privacy. "Why now, Mom?" asked Emily, her voice carrying the weight of years of abandonment. Helen sat down, her hands trembling as she pulled an envelope from her bag. "Your father, he wrote this for you. Several letters, actually, over the years. He never had the courage to send them." Emily took the envelope carefully, as if it might burn her fingers. Inside she found dozens of letters, some yellowed with time, all addressed to her. "He always loved you, Emily," Helen continued, her voice choked. "We both did. But pride, appearances, societal pressure, we let all of that become more important than our love for you. It was the biggest mistake of our lives." Lauren returned at that moment, carrying a tray with 3 cups of coffee and some of the sweets she had prepared especially for the party. "Grandma Amelia said that hot coffee helps heal old wounds," she said, placing the tray on the table. "And these are coffee brigadeiros with salted caramel. I made them myself." Helen tasted a brigadeiro and her tears began to fall again. "It's delicious, sweetheart," she said, looking at her granddaughter with admiration. "You have a special gift." "Just like Mom," Lauren replied proudly. "She taught me everything I know." Emily watched the interaction between her daughter and her mother, feeling a confusing mix of emotions. The pain was still there. The scars of abandonment hadn't magically disappeared. But there was also something new, a possibility of healing that she hadn't expected to find. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows of the Morning Star Bakery, illuminating the room filled with guests celebrating not only Mrs. Amelia's birthday, but also a moment of reconciliation that no one had foreseen. The tables were occupied by a curious mix of people, longtime customers, employees, neighborhood friends, and for the first time in 13 years, members of the Thompson and Smith family. Helen, still visibly emotional, watched her daughter and granddaughter interact with the guests. Emily had transformed into a strong and determined woman, so different from the frightened teenager who had left the mansion years ago. Lauren, on the other hand, moved between the tables with the ease of someone who had grown up surrounded by love and trust. "She's extraordinary, isn't she?" said Mrs. Amelia, sitting down next to Helen. "Your daughter. She's transformed not just this bakery, but the lives of everyone who knows her." Helen discreetly wiped away a tear. You You did for her what I should have done. I can never thank you enough." Mrs. Amelia smiled softly. "There's no need to thank me. Emily and Lauren have brought as much light into my life as I might have brought into theirs. That's how a true family works. We all grow together." In the center of the room, Lauren stepped onto a small makeshift platform, drawing the attention of everyone present. In her hands she held a leather-bound photo album. "Grandma Amelia," she began, her voice clear and confident, "this is our gift to you. Mom and I spent months collecting photos and stories from everyone who has passed through the Morning Star bakery over all these years. Because you're not just the owner of the bakery, you're the heart of this place." Emily joined her daughter, carrying an elaborate cake they had prepared together. A three-tiered masterpiece decorated with sugar flowers that replicated Mrs. Amelia's favorites. "When I first arrived here," Emily continued, her voice trembling with emotion, "I was just a frightened girl, carrying not only a baby but also the weight of abandonment and rejection. You taught me that family isn't just about blood, it's about daily choices of love and acceptance." Her eyes met her, mothers in the audience. Helen, who had always been so composed in public, made no effort to hide the tears streaming freely down her face. "And today," Emily continued, "I want to celebrate not just the birthday of the woman who took me in as her daughter, but also the possibility of new beginnings. Because true love, the kind that doesn't demand, that doesn't judge, that simply accepts and cares, has the power to heal even the deepest wounds." Lauren, sensing the delicate moment, took Helen's hand and led her to where her mother and Mrs. Amelia were standing. The three generations of women came together in an emotional embrace as the guests applauded. "There's enough room in this family for everyone who wants to be part of it," declared Mrs. Amelia, her voice carrying the wisdom of the years. "Love only multiplies, it never divides." In the days that followed, Emily finally found the courage to read her father's letters. Each page revealed the regret of a man who had allowed pride and social conventions to overshadow his love for his only daughter. The last letter, written from the hospital, contained a simple request. "Forgive us, daughter, not for our mistakes, but so that you yourself can move forward in peace." The Morning Star Bakery continued to grow, now with a new dynamic. Helen became a regular presence, gradually learning how to be a grandmother, rediscovering her daughter, and building a relationship with Lauren based not on social obligations but on genuine affection. One particularly busy morning, as Lauren taught her grandmother Helen how to make brigadeiros, to the amusement of everyone watching the elegant lady fumble with the chocolate, Emily observed the scene with Mrs. Amelia. "You know," Emily said, "for a long time I thought forgiving meant forgetting the past. Now I understand it's about creating space for a different future." Mrs. Amelia smiled, embracing the one fate had given her as a daughter. "Life is like making bread, my dear. Sometimes the dough doesn't rise as we expect, sometimes it burns a little around the edges, but there's always a chance to start a new batch, with more wisdom and love." Outside, Chicago continued its frenetic pace, but inside the Morning Star Bakery, time followed a different rhythm, marked by spontaneous hugs, genuine laughter, and the eternally comforting aroma of fresh bread, reminding everyone who entered that there's always room for new beginnings.